Well, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Stoked to chat. We chatted recently at the Ganja show in Minneapolis a few weeks back, and yeah, I think you'll be a great guest for this podcast. So, for a brief introduction, you were part of Dodge and Fuski, and I believe still doing music under Dodge and Fuski, and you co-founded Disciple Records, which was a really influential dubstep label that became home to people like Virtual Riot, Modestep, Barely Alive, etc. And yeah, I'm just interested to talk about all of that. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, exactly. As you said, yeah, all of the above, and a few other things as well. I think I was somebody asked me the other day, and I had to look it up. And at one point, I had 6 aliases going at once. But that's a whole other story in my background of where I got to that. But yeah. So Dodge and Fuski was kind of what got everything going for us, in terms of that was the first thing that really, we got started making an actual income from it rather than it just being, a glorified hobby that we'd been doing until at that point about 7 years before we started making any money. And then Disciple was a few years after that all started.
Right. At what point do you think the Dodge and Fuski stuff felt like a job and not like a hobby?
Straight in.
Or maybe not a job, but like when were you like, oh, this is the thing, and I can do this now for a living?
Yeah, it was crazy, man. It was like something I'd wanted for so long, and it felt like a pipe dream since I'd started. I remember when I was like 18, so this was 22 years ago or something. I remember going out and seeing Sub Focus and trying to hand him some demos that I was making, which would have been absolutely god awful drum and bass tunes. And from that point, it was still years onwards, but it was a very gradual process because it went from being, it wasn't like some of the guys, like these days, if you really pop off on socials, you really can go from making nothing to just like headlining within a year. And like back then that was a lot less common, and it definitely wasn't what happened for us. It started off with like €200 a gig. So it very slowly trickled from being hobby into job. I would say the biggest change came in 2000 and I have to remember the exact years. I think it was around 2011 that we signed management with Never Say Die. It was 2010, 2011. And that was the big turning point, really, because up until then we'd never really had like a full-time agent or anything like that. We'd had friends pulling gigs. So I think it was around about that, because it's a bit hard for me to remember, but I was on benefits for a while because of like ADHD and basically just not holding down jobs. So for a while they did this thing that was like called the New Deal for musicians, where you could essentially, if you were trying to be an aspiring musician, so it gave us like 18 months of essentially just sitting at home doing nothing else.
That was a UK thing, like the government was just giving you money to sit at home and make music.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy, yeah. There was a lot of, honestly, I credit massively the, it swings and roundabouts, there's good and bad things. I think I was just lucky that my path, it worked out for me. Where I grew up in quite a, in some ways, not like super bad, but like definitely like economically deprived rural area where there was a lot of people without meaningful jobs or anything like that. Like most of my friends, to be honest, my friend group, that I met through raving and stuff like that when I was in school, a lot of us were unemployed in those early days. Just because it's essentially you would either go and work in a supermarket, or you would have to kind of go down the route where you work for the local government or something like that. And I had dabbled with stuff, but I'm just so crap at holding down jobs. I think the longest I've ever had a job for was about 3.5 months. So being a terrible employee is what forced me down this path, really.
Yeah, I actually have a similar story. Yeah, that's pretty much my story as well. Is like couldn't hold down normal jobs, and so yeah, somehow music became the job.
I mean, humans adapt with necessity, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it's cool that the UK was doing that so long ago, because I actually just read recently, and I've just got it pulled up here, that Ireland is, or Ireland, however you say it, they're doing a similar thing now. It says here, Ireland has made its basic income for the arts, the BIA program, permanent, providing around 2,000 artists and creative workers with a weekly payment of 325 euros, which is approximately 350 US dollars. This initiative originally launched in 2022 as a 3-year pilot, and it was extended through to February 2026 to allow for evaluation and the planning of a permanent successor scheme. The program aims to address the chronic financial instability faced by creative professionals, blah, blah, blah. And then an independent report found that the pilot program generated nearly 80 million euros in total benefits to the Irish economy, including increased arts-related income and reduced reliance on social programs, yielding a return of €1.39 for every $1 invested. So they found that for every $1 that they gave to an artist, they got $1.39 back into the economy, which is really cool. And so now there's thousands of people in Ireland who get paid. I mean, it's not a lot of money. It's $350 a week, but it's kind of livable. Maybe I don't know what the housing market or anything is like there, but yeah, a really cool program that I heard about the other day, and I think that's great that they're doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I was one of the lucky ones to benefit from a program like that. And it's really interesting because, Ireland are great when it comes to stuff like that. Like, they're one of the few places that have managed to maintain free university education to the best of my knowledge. I mean, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm out of date of that, Irish listeners. But yeah, for me, that was, it's unfortunate, really, because, in my situation, it was great. I was very lucky. But the fact that I kind of then moved to America meant in that situation, unfortunately, I didn't pay back as much as, I probably should have done in terms of those years.
Wait, so the money that they gave you, you were supposed to pay it back?
No. But what I mean is like, in an ideal situation, you support the people that make music in your country, and then they stay there, and then they make music, and they bring that money back into the revenue. Like you were saying, the 139%.
Yeah, the $1
net revenue,
$1 out, $1.39 back in. Yeah. You're saying because you were moved to America, you didn't get the $1.39 back. I mean,
don't get me wrong. It's not like it was a huge amount of money, but like in principle, right. I would say it's interesting because it's great. It worked for me, but the kind of, in my situation, that didn't quite work out from the perspective of investment. But that was just, it's complicated. The reality is we moved to America is because if we hadn't, we would have had to have got a different job. That's I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but the way that everything changed so quickly over a couple of years was absolutely nuts. And it was basically like the options were, if you're lucky enough to have a US visa, you move to America and then you can continue to make a living, or you're going to have to like be forced to make a different genre or get a different job entirely, because the supply demand of how many DJs there were relative to how much promoters could afford to pay, governed by how much people were willing to pay for tickets, etc., and the amount of people that were willing to pay for those tickets was shifted so quickly. Anyway, we'll get to that. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit there. I tend to ramble a little bit when we go on topics.
That's perfect. That's what this podcast is all about. What was the UK dubstep scene like when you began? Because you began like kind of around the time, I believe, when Scream, Benga, all those kind of dudes were like kind of shaping that sound, right? Or were you a little bit after that?
So I started becoming aware of it pretty quickly after it started. I remember all like those really early tunes, but in terms of my involvement at that point, I was still like a failed and struggling drum and bass producer. Basically, at that point we'd been making music for 6 years, probably at least, like solid in terms of like contiguously on a daily pretty much basis, just doing nothing else since through university on into gainful unemployment for a few years after that. And it didn't grab me, to be honest, to begin with. I didn't really get it because I'd only really heard it at home, and I was a drum and bass head and just used to something with a lot more tempo and energy. And then I remember being at this party where I grew up. We didn't have a lot of money, and there weren't a lot of big nightclubs. It was more of a rural area, so you went to these kind of either someone had a big rural property where there'd be a big rave, or you would just go into the middle of nowhere where someone would bring a generator and there would be a phone you would call that would have directions, and you would try and get there before the police inevitably shut it down. Anyway, and I remember hearing like Cockney Thug and Mr. Chips by Rusco, and that changed everything for me. Like that was where everything started. It was like that. I was like, oh my God, this is sick. And I was like, okay, well, I've been trying to make drum and bass for years, and I'm like, I'm never going to catch up with Pendulum and Noisia and all these people. I love their music, but I just feel like I'm so far behind that it just feels unachievable. And then this music that was just getting going, and everyone was just figuring out the sound design, and like it wasn't as polished and refined from decades of, Goldie to Noisia. Do you know what I mean? There wasn't that yet. And I was like, okay. So I know it sounds a bit like I'm saying I was jumping on a bandwagon, but like it was really fun. Up until that point, I'd had very little interest in it because the sonic palette didn't appeal to me. But as soon as I heard that jump up fun element, I was like, okay, sign me up. This is sick. And so I just, I got Fuski. We were producing under different names. I think he was just DJ Fuski, which, by the way, they were pretty mashed. They'd been up all night, and someone was trying to say Husky, Fuski, and he thought it was hilarious, and that became his DJ name. For me, I used to just say, my friends used to try to peer pressure me into stealing from my parents' wine collection, which was mostly homemade and dreadful, but was, easy to, it was not locked away or anything. And I used to say, guys, it's getting a bit dodge. So that's where Dodge came from. Anyway, so yeah, so me and Chris started making dubstep, and honestly, it didn't take very long, really. I think it was like a few months into it, we made this tune called Porn Step, and I used to go out quite a lot in Bristol. I knew a few of the people that, the local producers and stuff. I'd sort of started to meet people through just friends of friends, and I met Ed Solo. And he came back to our house with some friends of ours, and I was like, can I play you something? And I played him Porn Step, and he was like, this is wicked. And then that's basically how it kind of all got going. We signed that to a label called Sludge. I think we'd had 1 or 2 releases before, because what we did, the only way we had of like breaking into the industry, as it were, because we grew up in this tiny rural community. We just moved to Bristol, granted, but we didn't really know many people, is we literally went on MySpace, because this was pre-SoundCloud, pre-YouTube, pre-any of this stuff. And we used I think it's called Friend Blaster Pro, and we ripped Andy C's friend list, and then we sent, because on MySpace you could upload music, so we uploaded all our demos, and we just like indiscriminately spent to about 20,000 people, sent a message saying, hey, got some new demos out, if you're interested, knowing that we would mostly 99% be hitting people who did not give a shit or had no collection to a record label. But eventually it worked. We had like 2 labels hit us back. So that kind of got things moving a little bit as well. And then it was like within a year, the Never Say Die stuff happened. But yeah, as soon as we started doing the dubstep stuff, and like, we found like, it's interesting because some of the stuff that we used to make back then, which sounds nothing like what I make now, is still kind of going, that sound.
Right. Yeah, I think there is a big thing with experiencing types of music in the correct context so that you kind of understand them. I had the same thing with psytrance. I listened to psytrance at home with my buddy Frosty back in the day, and I was like, it's kind of, I don't really get it. And then we went to what's called a doof in Australia, which is basically a psytrance party that is not supposed to be there. And I was like, holy shit, I get it now. Like, psytrance is fucking awesome. And then, started getting into that. And also, you mentioned how you use Friend Blaster Pro to just like send messages to tons of people on MySpace. That was super funny. Like I did similar things back in the day, like where you can essentially look at somebody's friend list and then like automatically send friend requests to all of them or send messages to all of them. It's so funny that like at that time of the internet, people hadn't figured out like the boundaries yet, so people were able to just like hack it and be like, send 40,000 pieces of information to these 40,000 people or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny that shit would never fly these days. Even sending like email to a lot of people these days costs so much money. Like if you have an emailing list of like, 50,000 people, to send an email to that many people, you have to subscribe to a thing for like hundreds of dollars a month.
Yeah, we also found with that it became pretty ineffective because you would have a bunch of people report spam and then it would essentially just end up getting auto spam allocated to a bunch of other people as well.
Right.
That was granted for a lot of my information is 5 years old because that's when COVID hit and I sort of, became no longer involved in the music industry for half a decade, which is, we'll come to that. But
yeah, we'll get to that. First of all, I'm curious how you and Fuski divided creative roles when you were working on music back in the day.
Yeah. So it really depended tune to tune. So neither of us were particularly great at sitting down together and making music together. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes there was just like the secret sauce, like someone made a melody that both was just like, oh, that's great. And then we would hot seat. But unless we were really onto something, there wasn't like, there's a couple of people like Valley, Virtual Riot and Culprit, John. Like those two people are like, when I sit down with them to make tunes, it's just, they're like the best experience I've ever had with people making music where there was no like, running into like awkward situations where you keep getting stuck and no one really wants to delete what the other person's done or, very seamless. But even with Fuski, it wasn't often like that. So we would basically just make tunes independently. And as soon as one of us came up with something that was interesting, we would sort of just be like, okay, we'll both jump on this and either we'll send the project back and forth because we were like living together in two different rooms, or we'll just sit together and work on it. So there were definitely different strengths between us. Fuski was way better at sound designing. I, to this day, am not a very good sound designer. I can make some very basic sounds, like particularly like kind of like more bass house garagey stuff where it's much more simplistic, more analogy sound design. Fuski was always really, really good at sitting there for hours making like Reese's and growls. So essentially he would do a lot of the sound design. I was in the earlier days better at doing mixdowns than him, which is kind of strange because you would think they were like very similar skills. But in terms of like composition and layering and stuff like that, I would generally do the final mixdown, but he would do most of this, if not all of the sound design. I would do some, but then I would, in terms of sound selection, I would often maybe put the drums down or something like that because I could hear when it was the right sound. I just wasn't as good as crafting sounds from scratch. It's funny, actually, I remember him watching your tutorials back in the day. I think you and then us with our early dubstep tutorials were like some of the really early ones.
Maybe
but yeah,
Tom
anyway,
Cosm
sorry.
as well.
Yeah, that's right. I remember because Chris was into quite a lot of different music. Anyway, so yeah, it really depended. There wasn't really like a specific role other than would say that Chris took the lead on sound design. Other than that, there would be some tunes where it would be mostly me, some tunes it'd be mostly Chris, some tunes where it was half and half. It was kind of all over the shop really, and then over time it became more me and less Chris because Chris just. Yeah, that's a whole story in itself, really. But it's crazy how many people in the music industry kind of burns out mentally, and like that happened very early with Fuski. Like he didn't even really make it as far as us starting to tour full time before it started to like the pressure of it or a lot of factors started to kind of get to him early on.
Yeah, it is a lot of stress to move from this being like a fun thing that you're just doing with a friend and just messing around, like making these beats that you think are cool to like, shit, now I have to get this done by this date because we've got this show. And like, not only do I have to finish this tune because that's got to come out, but then I got to build the set and then I got to like think about the show and like, it becomes, it definitely, I had the same experience when I was like transitioning from it being a fun thing to being more of a career that I definitely got a lot of anxiety about. Oh shit, like now I'm doing a remix for this person who's one of my favorite artists. This is like a lot of pressure, and but I think you get better at managing that over time. I think it's just like anything. What do you call it? Like not aversion therapy. Like if you just subject yourself to, I think, subjection therapy, maybe if you just subject yourself to like an uncomfortable experience a lot of times, it eventually becomes less uncomfortable, basically.
Oh, 100%. This is, I won't go too much off topic, but one of the projects I did was this hip hop group called Gypsy Unit, where I produced all the tunes. My brother played some of the instruments. We didn't really use many samples. And I did the rapping as well. That's a whole other story. Go look up on SoundCloud, people. But yeah, the rapping on stage, like we played some like Shambhala Festival and Boomtown. We played like a headline slot on one of the nights. And yeah, like trying to remember lines for like an hour set and rapping to people, like several thousand people, that will definitely increase your tolerance. Do you know what I mean? It's like a drug. Do you know what I mean? It's like the stress or the overwhelming threshold sort of just moves, you know. But yeah, going back to what you were asking about division of labor of Chris, I realize I answered that just with the context of the music production. So
exposure therapy, that's what it's called.
Yes, exactly. 100%. Yeah. Yeah, my dad has agoraphobia, which is quite complex and kind of the antithesis of exposure therapy through many generations. But that's a whole other story. But yeah, the other part of division of labor was when it came to doing anything like handling deadlines. What are we doing? Going out and get remixes, sending emails to people, dealing with finding out, do we want a manager? What does the manager do? Blah, 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 blah. That was like 90% me. Like Chris had very little interest really in the music business. It was purely music that he was interested in. And that's one of the reasons that he ducked out almost immediately with Disciple. He was in theory going to be a partner of that, but he very, very quickly ducked out because he just didn't want to do anything that wasn't involved in being directly creative. But yeah, so in the early Dodge and Fuski days, yeah, I was essentially sort of like the pseudo manager before we had a manager. And like in my later career, I was my own manager. Now I have a manager again coming back for different reasons. But yeah. So I was kind of more the driving force, and Chris was the kind of the better engineer.
Yeah, I do think mix downs, like you said, you were better at mix downs, he was better at sound design. I honestly feel like often mix down quote unquote mistakes are really just composition errors. Like I think if you get the composition right, have the right layers happening at the right time, and you know, make sure certain sounds are short enough that they fit in a gap, and like all this kind of stuff. I think if you just nail all of that, like the song really mixes itself a lot of the time. It's when you have a lot of shit happening at the same time that is just fighting with each other that it becomes difficult to mix. And so maybe it was just like you were better at composition, he was better at sound design or something like that, because like you said, you knew if it was like the right drum sound or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, it's more like, and this is something that all of us just pick up over the years, and it becomes completely effortless, and it makes it when you're quickly banging a tune together and like doing very little, like banging in some drums, putting in a tiny bit of sidechain and putting this, it seems effortless but very difficult to beginners, is because you just intuitively know what bits to put in, like, you know, the same, like, you know, somebody knows the alphabet, and if someone didn't know the alphabet, they wouldn't know, you know, where to begin with even sounds, you know. And so yeah, strange analogy. That's definitely not my best analogy of all time, but you know what I mean? Yeah, it's absolutely, that's one of the kind of the invisible skills that we all just pick up over the years.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, we should talk about, I guess, like, yeah, you did the Dodger and Fuski thing for a bit. Fuski kind of burnt out, and then you also burnt out and didn't make music for the last, whatever it was, 5 to 7 years or something. And now you're just coming back and making music again. Well, let's talk about the burnout first, but then I'm curious, like, to talk about how coming back has been and what you found different and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, yeah, so I have to be careful how I sort of phrase things, because there's so much context here. And like, okay, so I think the first thing I want to point out is my recognition that for a lot of people, it will be very hard to understand how someone who's in a position of having a very fun job, a lot of social privilege, in some situations making good money, for people to sort of, you know, people would be like, why would you ever not want to do that forever? And It's really difficult to explain. I would say one of the most pivotal issues is the damage on mental health that this seems to have. And again, it's one of those things, it can sound like, oh, what are you talking about, you person of privilege? But I think the numbers speak for themselves. Like, the amount of people that I know in this industry who either have drug problems or have, burn out completely, like loads of people have just dropped out that I've known over the years, sometimes worse. People that aren't with us anymore. It's a weird one. I think to understand it, you really need to understand the kind of people that end up in the music industry in the first place, right? We're people that don't fit into normal jobs, that people that haven't just found something earlier in life that they've gone with that's been an easier path. It's like the filter, right? We're the people who can only be creative, who are willing to like make no money for years and years and years on end. And there's like some driving force that's higher than, oh, I could just go to college and then I could go and work in Wall Street and make good money, right? Like there are easier ways to achieve success than what we've done. But so there's something else that kind of filters who we are. And a lot of it, I think, is some kind of neurodiversity or some kind of, emotional imbalance that leads us to being creative for a lot of people. So when you start off with an industry that already essentially has a much higher probability of people that might be neurodivergent or have mental health issues to begin with, I think that already explains a little bit of why you have elevated burnout rates. But for me particularly, there was another layer on top of that, because like I say, I'm talking there more about people I know who are just DJs, and that alone has burned them out. I don't think just being a DJ alone would have burned me out for that period, because that's what I'm coming back and doing now. It was the combination of doing that and doing so much left brain and right brain at the same time and dealing with many other things. For example, so the three of us that moved to America, me and Ross, who founded Disciple, and Dan, who then joined Disciple later, and was also doing art. He manages ISO now and a bunch of other people, but he even when I met him, he was an artist manager, but it became more and more consuming as the years went on. And all of those guys, we did a thing called Medic, so drum and bass thing, and those two had a thing called Astronaut. So all of us were very creative in making music. And the more that we started to build our businesses that were always kind of initially just meant to be a complementary platform to kind of, go along with everything else we were doing, they started to... I was the one that was able to maintain it the most in terms of still being active making music, but those two just stopped completely. So that was part of it. It was just the sheer kind of finite energy. And then a big, trying to tell the whole story of, like, I've started telling it on my reels, on my social media now, and it's taking a really long time to build the context. So it is very tricky to explain. But Disciple... I think I kind of need to go back a little bit. I'm not going to tell the full story of Disciple all in one sitting, but in terms of giving context to the burnout, a lot of things happened over the years that kind of added up to that. So Disciple, when it started out, it was no money but super fun. It gave us, it was the main reason we're doing it is it was a bunch of friends that were hanging out doing something that felt purposeful every day, right? And you got to hang out with your friends, and then it started growing, and eventually we got lucky and it started actually making money where we could employ people, and it built and we found these amazing artists and everybody got on great, and we were like in this crazy position where of everybody being friends and kind of living in LA, because a lot of people moved there because Ross was managing most of the artists. It was this crazy, I can't really think of another sort of situation like this, but unfortunately its biggest strength kind of became after a while its biggest weakness. Like, it became so big that it became almost impossible to manage. Ross, I won't go into details here, but was unbelievably stressed because he was managing, I think at one point it got to 11 or 12 acts himself with no assistant.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Just taking on way too much shit, and his hair fell out. That's another story, but that's how stressed he got. Literally fell out. No, he got. Yeah. I don't know if we want people to tell me about more details, but yeah, literally, from stress, full on nervous breakdown. For me, it became very difficult as things got bigger, and it became harder to communicate with everybody. There was a lot of miscommunication, and another part of it as well was people wanting to sort of start self-releasing. We could kind of see where people wanted to go. Like we didn't rope people down with exclusive contracts. The only people that we ever did exclusive deals were people where, say, their manager was like, oh, we want like a big advance and we'll do an X amount of tunes deal. Then we had to get our money back because it was like an advance for all of these tunes. So we had to lock people down. But generally speaking, people were there because they wanted to be there. So it took up more and more time as time went on, and I wanted to make music less and less. I'd also been touring for years and years as well. And part of it as well was like I wasn't as hungry as I was before, and I honestly felt some degree of kind of like, well, there's these young guys who are so much hungrier than me, you know, maybe it's just time to just move on and let these new guys come in. These were factors as well. I also, like, my DJ career, honestly, at that point had been pretty flatlined for a while, and I was doing everything that I could to try to like make better music, be entertaining in other ways, like coming up with cool video ideas, like, you know, the time we turned a Lambo into a bass sound, the time that we made music using some shitty like $50 PC I'd got off eBay or something like that. These fun challenge videos, like all of that stuff was great. But the touring, like, it was still this, like, you know, I grew up with not a lot of money, so I felt so guilty walking away from a job where I was making a good living, where, you know, I didn't have to, you know, I wasn't working for someone else doing what someone else is telling me all the time. Do you know what I mean? It's incredible place of privilege. So even when sorry, this is a really hard, complicated story to tell because there's so many reasons for it. It's not just like one thing. That happened. A lot of stuff. I won't get into details. We can't talk about it. But there's a project that I started that somebody that was like a kind of a thing that I was producing in secret, and then the person managed to kind of steal it from me. I'm not going to go into details, but this thing happened like a few months before my mum got diagnosed with terminal cancer, and then like COVID hit and like loads of shit. And part of the reason I quit touring is just because I quit music in general, and part of the reason I quit music in general is because Disciple in COVID, when our merch sales died, it took us away from profit, basically. It put us in a position where we were going to have to pay our employees more than we were making it every month. And we were like, there was no, like, is this ever going to recover? Which is why we sold, essentially the main reason. There's many, many reasons, but that's essentially the main reason we eventually agreed to CMG's offer. They'd been offering for years to buy Disciple because they wanted to build their catalogue. But yeah, so all of this stuff happened with that, with my mum, with like, you know, touring and just not, you know, it not feeling the same as it used to, and then Disciple essentially being put in a position financially where we were kind of forced to sell it. Don't get me wrong, you know, we're lucky, you know, it could have gone worse ways. And the great thing with the CMG deal is we didn't have to fire anybody. Like, that was the position we were about to be in, realistically. Is like, if we didn't do this, it's like we're paying people more than we're bringing in now that all the merch is gone. The streaming revenue dropped a bit, not crazy, but it just took away our margin. Our margin wasn't that big. We were a small company. So yeah, all our staff got to keep their jobs. They went to go work for CMG. They actually then started getting other benefits that we couldn't give them as a small company. So, you know, it seemed like the best outlet, but all of these things kind of added together, and I was like, I want to try and do another challenge now. So I went off and did other stuff for a few years, but yeah. Like I say, I really don't want to get into details with the other thing that happened, but like the other thing that I briefly mentioned on with you know, snaky behavior in the music industry was definitely like, that was kind of a catalyst for me falling out of love with it, to be honest.
Yeah,
and sorry, I know I've been rambling for ages, but like the music industry, you know, it's sometimes you can go without gigs for a while. Sometimes, you know, there's all kinds of factors, and like without the love for it, like sometimes it's harder to get through bits, you know?
Yeah, I feel that for sure. I think, like you said at the start, there's like, it's a hard industry to be in. The kind of person that gets into music are also the similar type of people who have addictive personalities maybe and stuff like that. And yeah, as a result, there is a lot of drug problems in the industry, like you mentioned earlier. I, for one, went through like a pretty brutal ketamine addiction and went to rehab for it. And I did a whole podcast about that with Mimi Page, talking about my whole experience with that. But yeah, I was doing ketamine daily for years before I went to rehab. So I firsthand know that people like me who are creative, who also, I think the other part of it is like, to be really good at music, you pretty much have to be addicted to it. You have to do it all day, every day, and just, you have to go all in on something, or all in on things. I tend to go all in on things in general. Like if I get into something, I get into it completely. And yeah, so drugs are just another one of those things. I also think producers are generally bad at being businessmen, and they're bad at like building systems. Like a lot of, I won't say non-neurotypical people, but like a lot of people I see in other industries are very good at building systems. So they're like, okay, here's kind of all the things that I do. I get information in from here, money comes in from here, I have to output something to here. And they kind of like, look at it as all this system that moves around and does stuff around their life. And they build systems to ingest the information properly, output things where they need to go properly, all this kind of shit. And I don't know if all creative people, I know a lot of creative people I've worked with are like this, and I'm particularly also like this, where it's just output, 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 and never like, how do I deal with the input, and how do I deal with like, putting shit where it needs to go and all this kind of stuff. And I think it's hard to be creative and to build a system at the same time, because the fundamental part of creativity is the output part. It's like, do the thing, keep putting parts in, keep doing whatever you're doing. I think it's hard to be in that mindset and also be in the mindset of like, okay, I need to build a system where this connects to this and this does this when this action happens, and like, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, where I fall apart, I'm quite lucky because my ADHD and whatever different things, like there's a few things that I have, by the way. There's I've been diagnosed with, it's ADHD, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, which is essentially a form of autism, and bipolar disorder. So these things also play into it for me in terms of my motivational matrix. It's like sometimes I have insane drive and sometimes I just can't do it some days, which is part of the reason that I just cannot hold down jobs. But yeah, so for me, that missing part of the system, as you say, like, so I've always had this drive to go and do stuff, but I've always been, the thing that drives me is also the thing that kind of holds me back sometimes. I'm just not very good at, I'm very good at like really thinking about specific details, but really not that great at just kind of like thinking about everything and keeping, a balanced view. Like, so for example, like, I had no management training, and I really had no idea what we were doing when we were building Disciple. And the biggest thing that I was shit at was really just how to be like a man, like a staff manager. I had no idea what I was doing there. And, I've always tried to compensate for a lot of business stuff, but I agree. When I get hyper focused and I'm just wanting to be creative, it's, there's a lot of stuff that I just, I'm kind of oblivious to. And again, it's just part of my character that drew me to doing what I do and being good at what I am and crap at what I'm crap at.
Well, you're doing music again now. What was it that you think sort of turned in your mind to make you told me the other day in Minneapolis that you really enjoy music again, and like you're writing music a lot and you're like excited to do shows and stuff. Like what was it that changed, do you think?
Yeah, well, like I say, like up until the point a lot of things happened, in the sort of 2015 to 2020 era, like that was kind of how I felt then. I was very excited, very passionate, but then like sort of diluting the kind of the creative energy, like I said, from, trying to manage people, which I wasn't very good at, trying to like manage relationships between acts and try to keep an increasing, growing pool of people still friends and working together, and all of those things really detracted from that because I lost focus on what I was doing in the first place, and it's, it was a crazy learning experience, and some things I did well, some things I didn't do well. But this time around, it took like 5 years away from it to kind of like, for that to kind of like filter out. I did other stuff, and yeah, it's kind of a long story really, but like I ended up putting myself into a position where I'd kind of created some systems where I really was not as busy as I should be. And yeah, I built a few businesses that I tried a bunch of different things. I won't bore people with too much details, but a couple of them failed and lost quite a lot of money. And it's one of these things, man. Like, you know, like I say, you know, my not holding down a job just means that I pretty much just have to be an entrepreneur forever. And it's just, some things work, some things don't. You've just got to keep going, you know? But yeah, there was like a realization. I think, you know, I was just in denial really for those years that I didn't want to do music. It wasn't so much that the music was gone. It's just that I conflated it with so many things. Like I would open Ableton and I would think, oh, you know, it would just make me think of shit that had absolutely nothing to do with writing music. I would open it up and it would just be like, it would bring back floods of memories. And like I say, the stuff that had nothing to do with music, like my mum just like going from normal to dead in 6 months, you know, like that all happened in the middle of this stuff. And it's really weird how your brain just goes this kind of like era compression. It goes, oh, this is stuff related to this and this is, do you know what I mean? And it was just like, it's fucking weird, man. It was really weird. Like you wouldn't, like logically it's like, what's that got to do with that? But like I would open Ableton and I would just have this kind of like, nah sort of thing. And I tried, I think, 2 years ago, I made a couple of tunes, and then a year ago, I made a couple of tunes, and I was like, am I serious? Do I have the passion that I need to be able to do this? You know, because it takes a lot of energy. And, you know, if there's younger guys that are hungrier and want to do it more, and, you know, part of me is like, they're going to out compete me, and two, they probably deserve it more because, you know, yeah, you know, it's, I don't know if that second part's true, but like, that's how it feels sometimes. But yeah, I'm just trying to remember the exact process of how it really came back. It was like I started making some house tunes and I sent them to Alex Tate and under my Just Say Yes project. And everything the last couple of times that I'd sent people music of the last few, everyone was like, oh, this is kind of cool. But for this time around, Tate was like, oh, let's work on this. Let's try and get something going. And a few people kind of encouraged me, like Valentin Virtual Riot, who lives with me and my wife. He'd been trying to persuade me for ages. He was like, I'll get you, you know, let me teach you some stuff. Let me get you back up to speed. And yeah, I don't know what it was. At one point, I was just kind of like, I did do this mushroom trip about a year ago, and I think that's also a part of it. I was kind of like, you know, I was just sick of feeling like resentful for the fact that we lost Disciple because of COVID, resentful for the fact of some snaky things that were done to me in the music of the industry, resentful for the fact that my mum died before my wedding and she never got to meet my wife, resentful, you know what I mean? And I did this mushroom trip and I was just like, no one gives a shit other than me. It's just not, no, you know, it's like, I just need to just fucking... I need to just fucking move on. You know, it's like the classic, you know, yeah. I don't know. I'm sure I'm far from the only person that's kind of fallen down that trap of self-victimization, but like eventually it just got to the point where, I was just like, enough's enough.
Yeah, no, I actually know a lot of people in the music industry who have gone down very similar things where they've told me similar stuff where when they open Ableton, it like triggers a visceral, like, kind of gross response, because, yeah, for some reason or another, like, you know, they got a lot of money stolen from them at some point, or they got, like, you know, undercut here and there, and, like, yeah, just, they open it up and, like, some capitalism type of trigger happens where they're like, oh, this is related to that, which is really sad, because I think opening Ableton and thinking about money should be like completely separated thoughts. Ideally, I mean, they really can't be, because we do live in a society where you do need money to live, and so at some point that thought has to happen. But yeah, I think it's important, or at least a good skill to have, to try to decouple the writing part from the how do we package it and sell it part.
Yeah, I mean, so I have two thoughts on that. One that I'll come to about, like, you know, the kind of the conflict of interest perhaps between music and money, or on the contradiction of that in terms of enabling it. But first of all, yeah, in terms of like that stress response, I mean, I suppose if you think about it, you know, like what did that person essentially take if you dial it back to like a reactionary response? Like, oh, that person potentially took your food source off the table, right? So like if you have this kind of reaction to it, it's because in like caveman terms, maybe you had an interaction with these other people and they snaked you and they took away the meat that you guys hunted together and you went hungry, and it's like, okay, you don't want to make that mistake again because that could cost you your life next time. So you have this intrinsic, think of this, aversion response, right? And then, yeah, with regards to the music, money thing, like I had some friends growing up in Bristol, there was this very kind of like hippie squat kind of scene, and this kind of attitude was very pervasive. There were a lot of contradictory kind of views here because I knew people that were into squatting and all kinds of shit, and like, yeah, I'm definitely not agreeing with all of their viewpoints, but the trouble with being like, oh, music shouldn't be about the money, being like, okay, so there's two ends of the scale, right? There's the people who do it purely for the money. They don't give a shit about the music. That it doesn't give them an emotional response. They're purely doing it for money. And then on the other end, you've got people who almost have this aversion to making money from music. Like they feel like it's like dirty, or they shouldn't be doing it, or they feel guilty. And here's the trouble is if you don't make music for money, if you don't make money from music, you are going to have to get a job that you probably don't love as much as music. It is going to drain you of your energy, and then you are going to make less music, right? So it's kind of like there's a necessary amount there if you actually want to be able to be focusing on it, right? So yeah, like I say, it's a sliding scale, but I mean, you know, there is a minimum bar if you want to be like focused on music that you do need to make.
100%, yeah. I do try to, though, decouple the two thoughts into like, I'm just going to try to make whatever I want, and then hopefully later me and my manager can come up with some plan as to how to package it into such a way that it makes sense. But yeah, it does kind of suck to have to think about both of those things at once, which is why we should all go to Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the music money thing is so tricky because I've been asked before if you do it mostly for the money or do you do it for the music? And the answer is I do it for the fun, which is kind of like in the middle, right? You know, like you have if you don't enjoy making the music, it's not fun. And then on the other hand, if you don't have any money, it's very hard to have fun because you can't really go and do things. So again, somewhere in the middle, I would say fun.
What do you think about labels these days? Do you still think that they have a use in today's sort of music releasing world, or do you think that it's totally possible and feasible for somebody to go their entire career without dealing with a label at all and just doing all self-releases and whatnot and trying to make their career happen that way?
Definitely feasible, potentially harder. So like in my situation right now, for example, right now, because I haven't released anything in 5 years, you know, a lot of the people that follow me on all my social platforms may well now, you know, because some of these accounts are nearly 15 years old, like some of these people may be well into their 40s with children and definitely don't go to dubstep raves anymore. So for me, I need awareness from people who don't follow me, and there's many ways to do that, but one of the most straightforward ways is you release on a label like Monster Cat, like I have, who have a bunch of fans who particularly are younger and potentially might want to come and see me DJ. So it's like a relevant audience to me. So that's the best value. But like at the end of the day, you could totally just make a massive banger that goes on SoundCloud and just everybody that hears it thinks it's amazing and reposts it. And eventually it ends up getting heard by all the big guys. And you've got Subtronics DMing you asking if you can send it to them so they can play it, right? And then that could feasibly all happen without a record label, yeah. But like, what's more likely to happen, I guess, is the question. I feel like, especially when there's not a huge amount of money in streaming, unless you have a massive hit, I feel like sacrificing the revenue of signing to a label in exchange for them, you know, them essentially just, you know, giving you a stage essentially to their audience, you know, is well worth it. I would take that over the money 100% in my position right now. But when I was, you know, for example, when I did Just Say Yes, when I was really busy with everything and I knew people who could repost it and get it going, most of that I self-released. And it did okay, you know. It's very hard to say. Like, you know, sometimes viral hits come from all kinds of random places. So I think it just
definitely
depends.
seems more luck based though, versus you're saying with a label it's more of maybe a slightly more surefire thing that a X amount of people are going to see it. Whereas maybe if you do it by yourself, it's possible that it'll blow up, but yeah, maybe not.
Depends how big you are. Yeah, it's like loads of I've seen it. Like in drum and bass is a great example. Go back 10 or 20 years and anyone who was anything was releasing on Ram or Hospital, whereas these days you go and have a look and it's like, oh, it's released on Culture Shock Music or something, right? And it's completely changed, and that's culturally thing that's changed because some of the distro platforms do a great job of just pitching to playlists without any label involved, and partly it's just because of the size of those guys. It's like if you're just starting out you might need a label. When you're that big, maybe you don't.
What were the you said streams, the money you make from streams is super low, so you're happy to split that with the label 50-50 because it's basically negligible anyway, which is true. But what were the best income streams you saw when working with Disciple? Like which parts of the label you think were generating the most money? Because I assume it wasn't the streams.
Oh, it was. Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of other smaller ancillary incomes, but honestly, it's as simple as this. It was bar 10% of other shit. It was like 2/3 streaming, 1/3 merch.
Really? 2/3 streaming is like most of the income.
Yep.
That's
and we didn't even, until Laserbeam, there wasn't really, it's like Never Say Die had some massive hits with like 10, like 100 million streams or something like that. We never really had anything like that. It was just accumulation of 10 years hard work and a lot of streams added together. Like towards the end, we had Spotify playlisting team were pretty, we're clearly very aware of Disciple, and pretty much every EP we'd get something in dubstep on, and that would be a huge revenue driver. And it would sometimes be track 4 on an EP. It'd be totally unpredictable, and that tune would get literally 10 times as many plays as everything else on the EP, and then that would be the revenue driver essentially, and they would add up.
Yeah, and that's kind of wild. Yeah, I would say for my case, streaming makes up like less than 10%, I would say, of my total income that I make as a
same for
producer.
me as a DJ. Yeah, for me as Dodge and Fuski, I would agree. Yeah, it was really just that. Yeah, I mean, Disciple, some labels I know did like these big deals where they would take money from the gigs and everything. We didn't do anything like that. There was no double dipping from management on that stuff or anything. So there was. That was really only our revenue sources. There were like sample packs and stuff as well, which were a part, but not a huge part.
Sample packs do well, I think. I think sample packs for me are definitely a bigger source of income than music streams. 100%.
Yeah, I think I can see, because it's interesting. I think it's like the people who are like really great engineers. I've seen the same thing, they do really well from the sample packs, and the people who just are really good, not the best engineers, but amazing at making, say, some pre-drop samples or something that goes viral and stuff like that. Those guys do way better from streaming. So it really kind of just depends.
Right. What were some patterns that you think you saw in artists on Disciple that kind of lasted more long-term versus maybe short-term one-hit wonder type people? Was there any sort of pattern that you would see in those kind of artists where you could tell this person is going to be around for a while and they're going to have a steady, growth over the next whatever years? Or is there any patterns that you noticed after 10 years of seeing artists grow where you were like, okay, that's the pattern that I see in that kind of type of person who's a long-term artist, not just like a short overnight success type artist?
So I'm thinking about, trying to be objective, like the people that did stick with us for a while and then the people that did just a few releases. And honestly, it was just down to them actually having the ability to finish music, because the guys that sort of we did some releases with at the beginning and then didn't would sort of, not all of them, but some of them moved on for other reasons, or, like a big part of our strategy as well was working with people that we could do this whole crew thing with, right? So people that could get US visas, people that could, had whatever reason it may be, with people who are willing to move, stuff like that. So that was a big factor. But there was some people who could have been there, but just simply they would send a cool idea and we'd be like, sick, finish it. And then they just never did. They just never sent us a finished version, you know. So they kind of like that. They just didn't do it, you know. They could have been there. And then yeah, like I say, some of them, like there was one guy we worked with earlier who lived in, I think it was Kazakhstan. He lived in like this like Arctic mining town. No, maybe it wasn't Kazakhstan, in like Siberia, maybe. I don't know. It was like somewhere really obscure, and he wasn't really willing to sort of, you know, move either to the UK or States or anything like that. And we were like, well, the whole point of what we're doing is we want to have everything on video. We knew right from the start, like what built over the years was what we wanted. But we, you know, like Barely Alive were like, they were within, I'd have to look up, but I think they were within the first, you know, sort of, certainly within the first year. They were one of the first ones that stuck around. The people, after a while, like everyone we signed pretty much stuck around. So there was like Virtual Riot, and then Barely Alive, Virtual Riot, and then we had Fox Stevenson for a while. There was a couple of people like Megalodon who came and went, but I think a lot of those acts, I think, what did Megalodon do? He did some stuff with us. I remember him being there at the early Disciple gatherings, but some people wanted to release on multiple labels and didn't want to be tied down. So really with us, I think that was a big factor as well. It was the people who were comfortable with like betting on us. But yeah, honestly, like if the music was good enough, we didn't really tend to like, people didn't tend to fall off unless they left by their own volition.
Right. Do you have any advice that you would give to developing producers who are like maybe just starting to put out music, or maybe they're writing music but haven't put anything out yet? Like what as a, you know, pretty big label owner, like what kind of strategy would you say is the strat these days? Or I mean, maybe it was the strat 5 years ago, but I'd still be interested to hear your thoughts.
So in terms of how we found like acts in the early days and moving forward. So in the early days, we were just scouring SoundCloud, trying to find anybody who just wasn't signed to a label. I think that's pretty much how we found Barely Alive right at the beginning, when we were basically a nobody label, right? And then as it grew, things changed. So when it got bigger, like we didn't have time to do that or need to do that, so we would usually upcycle from the smaller labels, and the smaller labels again are probably doing what we were doing and going through SoundCloud and just finding stuff that's been reposted and stuff like that. You know, we didn't sign necessarily the Barely Alive tunes that were on their SoundCloud, but we were like, hey, this is sick, want to make an EP? And you know, so getting stuff out there and then just trying to like get signed to just anything you can do to get eyeballs. It doesn't really matter what it was. I was doing, someone asked me this the other day, like, you know, what's the most effective way, you know, to like get to a point, you know, to get gigs and stuff like that. Because, you know, I'm in that position myself now, right? Coming back, I'm now like, okay, I need all these new young kids to know who I am and want to buy tickets. So, and there's two extremes and everyone's kind of in the middle of them. Like, you know, so you got the one extreme, which is, absolutely no social media whatsoever, but you make this massive tune that literally everybody's playing. Like, you know, you make the next Laserbeam. I'm not saying Ray Volpe was doing no socials, but let's say you made Laserbeam but nothing else. That in itself would be enough. And then the other end of the spectrum, you could go on Love Island without making any music, and you wouldn't be playing the same gigs, but you would absolutely, people would book you just because people would show up, and then everyone else is in the middle. So I don't think there's a singular approach, but for Disciple, we were looking for the guys that were on the smaller labels that had really good mix downs and were like, you know, very obviously going to keep getting better. So if you're just starting out, the main thing is like in the early years when your ears aren't super trained to mix downs, you can't really tell. I couldn't anyway. I didn't know how bad my music was, essentially. I'm going to point it at myself rather than anybody else. But I didn't know how bad my
Dunning-Kruger effect, right? It's like you have this curve where when you barely know anything, you think you know a lot, and then there's this big dip when you start to learn a little bit where you realize you know nothing, and then it kind of flattens back out towards the end. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So persistence, I mean, don't be disheartened. It took me 7 years before I made a cent from music, from when I started, you know, using a sequencer, using Cubase. That was 7 years. I think it can be a lot quicker these days because you've got YouTube tutorials and you've got like other ways of getting music out there. Not to mention you've got Splice and just like when I was making music initially, we had sample packs, but they were all like techno sample packs. So we had to kind of engineer a combination of those together with like the live drum kit samples from Reason or something like that.
Yeah, it was like all the Vengeance samples.
Yeah, exactly. Vengeance. Yeah. Whereas nowadays you literally go on Splice and type in rhythm kick and it's like perfect. You don't even need to EQ it, you know, so very different.
So yeah, man. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it, and thank you.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Yeah, we'll chat again sometime soon, I'm sure.
Hope so.